Chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, Dana Gioia is an internationally acclaimed poet, critic, educator, and former business executive. He received a BA and an MBA from Stanford University and an MA in comparative literature from Harvard. For 15 years, and listen up, AIE students who have all had day jobs, for 15 years he supported his writing by working as an executive for General Foods in New York, eventually becoming vice president of marketing. An influential critic, he's well known for his 1991 book, Can Poetry Matter?, about the role of poetry in contemporary culture. His collection of poems, Interrogations at Noon, one of 3 full-length books of poetry, won the 2002 American Book Award. But Chairman Gioia is very much an interdisciplinary wonder and very much in line with the thinking of so many of the students in this program. He is a well-known literary anthologist, a longtime commentator on American culture and literature for BBC Radio, who was trained in music and was a classical music critic for the San Francisco Magazine. His poetry has been set to music by many composers in genres from classical to rock, including a full-length dance theater piece, Counting the Children. He is an active translator of poetry from Latin, Italian, German, and Romanian. In 2001, Chairman Gioia founded Teaching Poetry, a conference dedicated to improving high school teaching of poetry. And he is a founder and co-founder of the Westchester University Poetry Conference, the nation's largest annual all-poetry writing conference. He's taught writing at, it's your resume and not my usual state that I am so breathless. He has taught writing at Johns Hopkins, Sarah Lawrence, Colorado College, and Wesleyan University. Nominated by President George Bush in January 2003, Chairman Gioia was unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate. Today, with all the many subjects he could obviously be talking to us about, he is speaking on something that I think is clearly close to his heart, poetry and education. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest.
It's a pleasure to be here today. If I'm moving oddly, it's because I have so many wires and boxes attached to me that it limits my mobility. I hope that you can. I'm on a house mic right now too, I believe too.
Yes.
Yeah, but I think one wouldn't need a mic to address such a small group. I'm really delighted to be here today because I feel that, I mean, and this may be my judgment, not yours, that we're all in this together. That this is of all the groups I've spoken to at Harvard, this is the group that is most like family, which is to say that you are people who, because of various personal problems and learning disabilities that I share, decided to become an artist in the United States of America, and believe in what you're doing, and you're trying to bring it to people who I think you think, we believe, we hope it can make a decisive difference in their lives. And because of that, I don't want to talk to you at a high level of abstraction. So much of my official duties requires me to speak, in long, rolling sentences made up entirely of abstract nouns. And that's what public office is all about. And what I wanted to do was to talk to you artist to artist, teacher to teacher, mixed up individual to mixed up individual, idealist to idealist. And I thought that the best way for me to do this was to talk about my own art and to talk about some of the ways in which I've tried to figure out what role does it have in the life of the people I know, the communities I've lived in, the nation that I live in. And I want to start with, I'm really going to cover 3 subjects. The first is what I think poetry is about. Secondly, what is the purpose of a literary education? I mean, why, and then finally, what I think in practical terms putting poetry into a curriculum does. Now, let me start with three core beliefs. You may or may not share them. I suspect that even if you don't believe about them, in poetry, probably in your own art, you sense something parallel. The first is that poetry is one of the indispensable human arts. It is, with dance and song, the primal art that goes back to our origins as humans. And if you go back into tribal cultures, a lot of arts that we think of as separate are really one thing together. They move their bodies, they sing, they chant poems which tell stories, communicate lyric moments, contain, as it were, the culture itself that's being passed on. Now, they've become separated in societies as they develop, but there's something very basic, about these that go back to this. Are we having a technical problem here that we need to? Okay, just make sure that. Okay. Now, the second assumption that I'm going to make for this talk is that for a variety of reasons, poetry is neither well taught nor well understood in our society. That, in fact, our society has very little room for poetry except in schools. The public culture of our newspapers, television, radio, and popular entertainment hardly mention poetry, especially when compared to sports, finance, politics, weather, food, money, or entertainment, the important topics. And in our educational system, poetry still exists, but it occupies a much smaller portion of the curriculum than it did 50 or 100 years ago. One can, in fact, document that by the percentage of poetry that's in the books. I mean, if you go back to the MacGuffin readers, you'll see that Milton was introduced in 4th and 5th grades, and that, huge sections of poetry, things that we nowadays would only study in graduate school, were part of the elementary school curriculum. That, in fact, to the degree poetry exists in our schools, and once again, I think you can make some of the analogies to the other arts, it's considered an intimidating and unattractive subject. Now, my final assumption is that poetry is important. It's neither well taught nor understood, and yet I suspect that every one of us in this room knows that one great teacher can change your life. One decisive encounter with someone, and it could be a teacher in school or it could be a teacher in your art, opens up possibilities in your life that you would not have been able to access yourself. Now, I can remember 2 or 3 people in my life, and I was lucky enough to have more than one great teacher in my life, that, in a sense, made the life that I've come to lead possible for a kid that was a working class kid in immigrant households, growing up in sort of working class Los Angeles. Most of my friends did not have those possibilities opened up, and have not been able, I think in some ways, to develop the lives that they might have liked to have led. And so, in my case, these are mainly music teachers or English teachers that did this. In your case, it would perhaps be different disciplines. Now, I'm saying this because I think it's important for us to understand, to believe, to indeed embody the fact that even in this great institution dedicated to veritas, truth, culture is not made up of institutions. Culture is human energy. And those institutions are merely the repositories or the vessels of that energy. the quality of human being, the quality of energy, the quality of dedication that come into those institutions have the ability either to transform them or to ruin them. So if culture is human energy, so is education, and especially arts education. Though our legislators and our administrators often forget this. Education is powered by human energy. And those of us who have taught know that it's a transaction which is specifically between us and a group usually of younger people who are looking to us simultaneously for instruction in a specific discipline, but also for guidance in the development of their own life. That is, I think, at the heart of how one has to look at culture and education as particular forms of human energy. So let me restate my three assumptions, and then I'm going to go on from them. First, if poetry, and by extension the other arts, is an indispensable and important human art, if poetry were better taught, better understood, more widely practiced and promoted in our education by great teachers who can change people's lives, then I think just the potential that people in this room have in creating a society which is, to borrow a phrase from the Irish poet Yeats, closer to our heart's desire, is a tangible reality. Now, before we get too far involved in this, let's bring a poem in, just so we have the phenomenon. I hate discussions of art that don't have art. As chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, whenever we have the National Council meeting, we integrate performances and exhibitions into it, because I don't want, as it were, the national stewards of this institution to lose touch with the phenomena of art. So here's a poem, I'm sure most of you know it, by W.H. Auden. It's called As I Walked Out One Evening. As I walked out one evening, walking down Bristol Street, the crowds upon the pavement were fields of harvest wheat. And down by the brimming river, I heard a lover sing under the arch of a railway, love has no ending. I'll love you, dear, I'll love you till the river jumps over the street. Excuse me, I'll love you, dear, I'll love you till Africa and China meet, till the river jumps over the mountain and the salmon sing in the street. I'll love you till the oceans are folded and hung to dry, and the 7 stars go squawking like geese about the sky. The years may run like rabbits, but in my arms I'll hold the flower of the ages and the first love of the world. But all the clocks in the city began to whir and to chime. Oh, let not time deceive you. You cannot conquer time. In the burrows of the nightmare, where justice naked is, time watches from the shadows and coughs when you would kiss. Into many a green valley drifts the appalling snow. Time breaks the threaded dances and the diver's brilliant bow. In headaches and in worry, vaguely life leaks away, and time will have his fancy, tomorrow or today. Oh, plunge your hands into water, plunge them up to the wrist, stare, stare in the basin, and wonder what you've missed. The glacier knocks in the cupboard, the desert sighs in the bed, and the crack in the teacup opens, a lane to the land of the dead, where the beggars raffle the banknotes, and the giant is enchanting to Jack, and the lily-white boy is Aurora, and Jill goes down on her back. Oh, look, look in the mirror. Oh, look at your distress. Life remains a blessing, although you cannot bless. Oh, stand, stand at the window, while the tears scald and start. You must love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart. It was late in the evening. The lovers, they had gone. The clocks had ceased their chiming, and the deep river ran on. Now, the experience of that poem, its pleasure, its wisdom, its discomforts, its consolations, and its mystery, is something I want to keep fresh in our minds as I go on abstracting and conceptualizing. Because poetry is a special way of speaking, as indeed all of the arts are a special way of articulating human experience in a way that cannot be adequately reflected through concepts and ideas. It is embodied knowledge. And even if you believe, as I do, that not only is poetry important, but it is an art whose pleasures, consolations, instructions, discomforts, and mysteries are actually available to the common person when properly presented. I have to admit that this is not an assumption shared by most of humanity, especially in the educational community. For many people, poetry and the arts remain intimidating, distant, and even surprisingly, given their beauties, unattractive. Whereas our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents took a love of poetry and a familiarity of poetry for granted, it is now in our society a kind of specialized knowledge that lives on a kind of life support system in classrooms, supported by criticism, analysis, and theory. Now this brings me to what the issue is, I think, in some ways, which is, how do you teach poetry, and why would you bother to teach it? And you can say the same thing about how do you teach music or dance or the visual arts, and why bother when there are so many other obviously important things to do? Now, the chief challenge of teaching poetry, and I want to keep bringing it back to my specific art, is that we are trying to teach embodied knowledge, experiential knowledge, which is why the chief issue is, how do you resist changing the art into something else, usually criticism, changing it into ideas or concepts. And I would say that poetry is less like an academic subject, like mathematics or geography or even grammar in some ways, than it is like music, art, PE, or driver's ed. That it is embodied knowledge, physical knowledge, that like dance or song, dancing and singing, poetry involves your body. And I think that the one superiority, perhaps the only superiority it has to music and dance, is that it's available to a broader range of people. People you would never want to hear sing or see dance can actually recite a poem rather well. But all of these arts are holistic. They involve the intellect, the emotions, the intuition, imagination. The older I get, the more I recognize that there's a reason that memory is the mother of the muses. It's not just about the memorization of performance, but the older an audience, the richer the life experience they bring to a work of art. But perhaps they lose the freshness and vulnerability of youth but they bring a lifetime into the theater or the gallery or the classroom, which enriches that. And it brings, this holistic knowledge appeals to the physical body. The arts are embarrassingly physical. This is the key insight. Now, we apprehend a poem, therefore, before we understand it. We can, in fact, love a poem, be genuinely moved and consoled and instructed by a poem which we do not fully understand. In the same way, we can fully understand a poem that leaves us cold. There's something quite distinct about the analytical act in regard to art. In the same way that we can recognize a poem in a foreign language as a poem. Vivamus mea lesbia, atque amemus, rumoresque senum seriorum, omnis unius aestimemus asis, soles occidere et redire possunt, nobis cum semil occidit brevis lux, nox est perpetua una dormienda. Does anybody recognize those lines that were written 2,000 years ago by the poet? You can actually make a genealogical chart between that poem and blank verse and the Renaissance up to the modern age. It's the poem by Catullus, written to his beloved, which Ben Jonson translated, losing a little of the sex appeal, but capturing the playfulness of, "Come, my Celia, let us prove, while we may, the sports of love. Time will not be ours forever. He at length our joys will sever. Spend then not his gifts in vain. Suns that set may rise again, but when once we lose our light, 'tis with us perpetual night. Nox est perpetua una dormienda. Night is one everlasting sleeping." So we can apprehend it physically even without, as it were, intellectual access into the content of a poem, a painting, a piece of music. And some critics like Harold Bloom or reader response critics like Stanley Fish even suggest that misinterpretation is the natural response to a work of art, that we will by definition in a sense subjectivize it and misinterpret it, and that's okay. So and that's why in all of the arts we not only teach theoretically or analytically, but we teach first and foremost through experience and emulation, by doing a physical movement and showing it to someone, by showing the keys on the piano, by speaking and re-speaking and memorizing the words of a great poet. And this responsive, parodistic, imitative, subjective translation of a work, of a tradition, is how we keep an art alive. There is a great danger in America that when a choreographer dies and his or her dance company is dissolved, the whole physical method of teaching those particular movements is lost with it. And that, in some cases, mutatis mutandis, is true of all of the arts. So that raises the issue is, what then is the purpose of a literary education? Now, I regret to say that the purpose of education in poetry at a great many American universities is to produce professors of poetry. And you see this more and more of the undergraduate curriculum is being taken over of things that were formerly done in graduate school, preparing people for the level of critical discourse that they will need to write their dissertations. And in the case, more and more of the actual experiential embodied knowledge is getting pushed out. And what role, is the role of poetry in education to produce professors of poetry? It's an interesting proposition, not a very compelling one. And if you take it one level of abstraction higher, what is the role of imaginative literature in education? Fiction, poetry, drama. And most people that are involved in it tend to answer the question in two ways. The first is the institutional answer, and it's not a bad answer, but it's an institutional answer, is that we use poetry for a number of conscious purposes. Now, if you look at the history of American education over the last 2 centuries, you will see that poetry was used to teach grammar, rhetoric, figurative language, diction, vocabulary, enunciation and public speaking, literary analysis, we're getting closer to our own age, critical argumentation, very big today, critical thinking, and finally, all of the Western poetic tradition for 3,000 years of masterpieces is now mainly used in American universities to teach freshman writing. Now, these are all actual, current, or historical purposes for which poetry is used. And I think we can collectively call them the conscious, public, visible purposes of poetry, the intentional uses. But there remains, I think, for poetry and for all of the arts, and I'm going to get visionary here before I modulate into my dully practical conclusion, is that there are at the center, and there must remain, what I would call the occult and arcane uses of poetry in education, those which are not public, intentional, or immediately visible. The second uses of poetry refer to the subjective, private, and initially invisible process of growth that poetry and the arts initiate or facilitate. I suspect that most of you have not read the Bible today, so I'm going to read you part of a chapter from the Gospels. The same day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the seaside, and great multitudes were gathered unto him, so that he went into a ship and sat. And the whole multitude stood on the shore, and he spake many things unto them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went forth. And when he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside, and the fowls came and devoured them up. Some fell upon stony places, where they had not much earth, and forthwith they sprung up, because they had no deepness of earth. And when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them. But other fell into good ground, and brought forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. Who hath ears to hear, hear. Who hath eyes to see, see. This group, I believe, has both those eyes and ears. What we're talking about, and this is why I read the parable of the sower, is that for most students, for most people, the process of arts education, the process, the uses, the purposes of art are mostly unconscious. A little moth flickering basically at the very edge of your sight, a discovery of a change inside of them that perhaps initiates much change to come. The poetry teacher, the teacher of literature, the drama coach, the speech teacher, all of the people that are involved in literary education facilitate this invisible process. Now, we do this while we're doing a public, intentional task. And the two of them, the public and the private, the intentional and the intuitive, the visible and invisible, need one another. And that when we teach the arts, we must leave room for both processes. It's very easy to push the invisible out by so focusing on it and leaving no room, by throwing this seed on shallow ground where it does not take root. So in this sense, the artist's role, the teacher's role, touches, as I believe it should, on the religious. A faith in things unseen, a conviction of the value of the spirit, an understanding of the continuity of the living and the dead, which to me is fundamental for any art, is that continuity. If I.B. Singer is right that, quote, literature is the memory of humanity, end quote, then one purpose of a literary education is to allow the present to hear the past, so that together they might create the future. Not on some vast social scale, but on the level of the individual. The young individual, especially standing on the threshold of an adult life. Because literature, unlike physics or history or political science, reminds us that life is first and foremost experienced individually, one person at a time, by the individual consciousness wrapped in its time, place, culture, and personal history. Now, knowing that, what then are the proper intentional purposes of bringing art into a curriculum, into a crowded curriculum, of bringing poetry into a curriculum? Robert Frost once remarked on poetry's role in education, why poetry is in school more than outside in the world, the children haven't been told. They must wonder. And I think, Frost's question is worth pondering. Why, everywhere in the world, is poetry part of education? We know that generally teachers don't like to teach it. They feel that it's intimidating to them and to their students. Now, we know that what the primary reason is that in any institution it's generally more trouble to change something than keep it going on. But is poetry's role in education internationally simply the result of inertia? I don't think so. I think is that intuitively we understand that poetry embodies something essential to human development, something enormously helpful and nourishing to human potential, especially in children. The physical, mental, imaginative, and spiritual development of children. Now, what are these things? Now, they are not easy to separate into abstract, monadic concepts, because poetry develops the whole person in a complex and interconnected way. But for the sake of argument, let me state 4 qualities or virtues that poetry embodies. First, poetry is a powerful way of teaching language. It improves a student's command of both spoken and written language by containing instruction and delight, and by stocking the mind with memorable images, phrases, metaphors, and statements. I could give an entire lecture on why anyone needs to be educated by metaphor, to be able to use metaphors, to understand when they're true and when they're not true. But I won't. Second, poetry is a way of teaching feeling and perception. Since poetry, unlike mathematics or science, recognizes the emotional content of language and communicates through images, emotion, metaphor, and association, it develops our feelings, our intuition, and our imagination as valid means of communication. I think, and I think everyone in this room knows of instances where people can communicate in a kind of abstract way, but in a way which does not engage, recognize the emotions that are on both sides of something. Poetry teaches essentially that feeling, emotion, is a necessary part of most human communication, and it, in fact, can change the meanings of words, change the meanings of ideas. Third, poetry helps students understand that language is holistic. Poetry demonstrates that how something is said is an essential part of what is being said, that literal meaning is only one kind of meaning. I don't think I have to tell you why that's an important lesson. Poetry develops an appreciation, the tone of voice, word choice, choice of image and metaphor, even rhythm can carry meaning. This is a process of learning that Robert Frost called education by metaphor. And fourth and finally, poetry helps both enlarge a student's humanity and endow him or her with the power to articulate it. One of the chief uses, the chief necessities of literature is to enlarge our experience, to allow us to see the world through the eyes, ears, skin of another person who is in some sense different from us. To develop our understanding and response as well to important life events, love, birth, age, death, marriage, war, loss, that we might not yet have experienced, but may inevitably face. Literature prepares us imaginatively and spiritually for our life's journey, to develop an inner life capable of facing, comprehending, and mastering exterior life. Language, perception, communication, compassion, humanity, these are not small gifts to give to a child. They are fundamental qualities needed to become fully human. They are essential to both the individual and society. And anyone who thinks these are luxuries is missing the picture. Let's end with the poem. What shall we do? How about some Shakespeare? When my love swears that she is made of truth, I do believe her, though I know she lies, that she might think me some untutored youth, unlearned in the world's false subtleties, thus vainly thinking that she thinks me young, although I know my years are past the best. Simply I credit her false-speaking tongue. A simple truth is thus on both sides suppressed. But wherefore says she not, she is unjust? And wherefore say not I that I am old? Ah, love's best habit is in seeming trust. And age in love loves not to have years told. Therefore I lie with her, and she with me, and by our falsehoods we both flattered be. Okay. Thank you very much. Now, I'd be happy to entertain any questions. Whether I can answer them is, is another question. Anything I can say in a private or official capacity? Yes. Hi, introduce yourself so I know who you are.
My name is Lolita Taiwanski. I'm in the Arts and Education class, and I also was at your lecture yesterday, the one you did at the Opposites Theater.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you mentioned that, and I can relate to this from my father, being the same, that in years past and generations past, poetry was just a given in the curriculum. But then now we've come to the opposite end of the spectrum. But you did mention that it's hard to change something, but it has changed from that. And to what do you attribute it?
Well, I think what I was not alive 200 years ago, so I can't say with firsthand knowledge. But it did seem to me that, in a curious way, earlier education was much more practically focused on developing, as it were, kind of complete members of the community. And that speaking, writing, listening, knowing a common lore was really taken for granted. And as more things got added to the curriculum, a lot of the, as it were, the invisible parts of the curriculum disappeared. I mean, think of the things that are taught in high school now that simply weren't taught 100 years ago. Now, we don't want those things to go away, but what's happened is that it's pushed these things down, and so poetry, for example, which used to be across the curriculum, is now basically used as a tool to teach analytical writing. And I think that's a legitimate but a minor use of poetry. Now, I mean, one of the most effective ways, I think, I mean, there's three ways of bringing art into a classroom, I think. The first is just exposure. It is a great lack in our society that most kids have never seen professional spoken drama, never seen dance, never seen opera, have never been to a symphony. And just to bring kids into a symphony hall and hear a concert is a wonderful thing. Now, that in itself does not exhaust the possibilities of arts education, but it seems to me one of the things we just have to do is to incorporate this into their life experience, into their realm of the possible. The second is the arts education, where you actually train somebody to sing, to read music, teach them basic movement, teach them some basic drawing, et cetera, et cetera. That is the core of it. But there's a third thing, and we've really lost a lot of this, which is integration of the arts into other subjects. My mother, learned poems. I mean, my mother's a working-class Mexican girl from L.A. She learned poems in history class. Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight poet of Paul Revere was that on the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day. And it was integrated into it. And, oh, Captain, my Captain, and things. And so to bring the arts across the curriculum is a natural way of using great paintings to illustrate things out of history, to bring music into history, to bring film into history, those classes. And so, and I think we've lost that. And I think that also we've forgotten, how many of you are in some sense involved in the performing arts? I mean, there's something that you know that unfortunately the educational system doesn't, is how effective performance is as a learning tool of taking somebody and developing enormous personal capacity. I mean, I'll give you an example. Even in the humble, largely unperformative art of poetry, I had a class at Sarah Lawrence. These were the most privileged kids imaginable. And they were doing graduate degrees, and I insisted that they memorize poems every week, which struck them as a barbaric custom. They were embarrassed for me, but they wanted to get good grades, and so they did it. And so I had a brilliant student. If you teach, usually your best student always sits at your right hand. It's very biblical. And this young lady was amazing as a student. But she never memorized a poem. So so I started off with Shakespeare, and everybody had to memorize a sonnet. And so she would say, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease has all too short a date." And it was like about 30 years ago, my mother-in-law, a woman who delights in tormenting me, bought me a talking portable Japanese alarm clock, which was, and which spoke with a Japanese accent. It would say something like, 12 o'clock, and it was kind of this Japanese talking alarm clock voice that these kids, and it was just appalling. It was just like one horrifying recitation after another, and because they'd never connected, literature with orality. And then there was one young lady in my class who was the worst student. Everybody knew she was the worst student. Everybody treated her really as a kind of loser, because believe it or not, women can be cruel to one another. And so she came there and she said, well, I didn't like any of the poems. I didn't memorize any of the sonnets. And I said, well, that was your assignment. She said, well, I didn't like them. I said, well, okay, well, what did you do? She says, well, I noticed that when Romeo and Juliet meet, they speak a sonnet to each other. And, do you remember that, the thing where he touches her hand, he wants to know if it's okay. And they have a dialogue, and they trade lines of a sonnet back. And so she began, and she said, I'm going to borrow your hand, if I may. I hope this doesn't constitute sexual harassment, But yeah. And she goes something like, and he goes, if I profane with my unworthy hand this holy shrine, my gentle sin is this: my lips, two blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth this rough touch with a tender kiss. To which Juliet, because the women in Shakespeare always are smarter than the women, picks up his metaphor, which is of the shrine, and the pilgrim says, good friend, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. And Romeo, being a guy, wants to see, how much he can get away with. He says, have not saints' lips and holy palmers too? And Julia, she used to put her foot down. She goes, aye, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer. And they trade these lines back and forth, and this girl was bewitching. And then we moved to the next girl, went to these sessions of sweet silent thought. I summon up remembrance of things past, and I went through the whole class, and finally I just was so, oh God, so I asked her, would you do your poem again? And she did it even more magnificently. And two things happened from that experience. First of all, everybody treated her with more respect, because they understood that even though she wasn't performing, the analytical, conceptual, critical stuff the way that she was, there was something about what she had that was very essential to the art. And secondly, she got much more interested in the class, and she really engaged. And so, and I think every, teacher has these moments where suddenly you figure out something you should have known before you started. And, and it says that there is and must be in an educational system more than one path to excellence. There should be ways of recognizing the various gifts that you have and being able to bring them forward. And when we lose performance, that's where you turn the class clown and the class problem into a star. You channel the dark side of the force, into the classroom. And I think we lose so much of that because we create especially in literature and art that's really almost entirely conceptual and analytical now. So another question. I'll try to be more brief in my answers. Yes.
I'm wondering what you think about teachers who use things like hip-hop lyrics or popular music as an entryway into examining poetry.
I think it's a legitimate entryway as long as you don't let it overwhelm everything else. I mean, it seems to me wisdom for a teacher to know where the students are so that you can begin in a common place, acknowledge common things. I mean, I'll give you an example of, I think, one of the grave errors that poetry teachers make, which is where they'll say, oh, don't like rhyme, don't like meter, and so they make students ashamed of their own pleasures. And I think that you have to begin in some common area of delight. And the thing is, it's not say, don't like rhyme, don't like meter. It's like, don't just like those, listen to the other ways that language can be shaped. So I think that, now if you spend the whole year on hip-hop, I think you're missing the boat because you're not starting where they are, you're just staying where they are. But right now we have a generation who listens to language shaped for expressive effect in rap. And I think that's a powerful thing to begin. Same thing with fiction. The way that kids know how stories move today are mainly through movies. Now, I think you have to take that energy, take that learning, take that knowledge, and build on it. Many kids now do not know how to read a novel. They cannot sustain attention to the printed page. And we have to use what they know about storytelling and what they know about narration and things like this, which in the case of films is highly sophisticated. Rock lyrics too. I mean, there's some magnificently well-written rock lyrics. Now, you put them on the page and they lose a little of their fizz, but they're still really interesting things. And so the book I do, we have a whole chapter on song, which we bring in rock lyrics, blues, and other things as a way of just acknowledging the validity of that part of your experience. You know, you shouldn't cut off the kids' own strengths, you know, and you have to validate their own experience in some ways, and that's what you can build on. Yes?
You're expressing some wonderful ideas for arts education and how to maximize children's strengths and so forth. How are you able to express some of these personal viewpoints of yours through your job?
Well, it's arts education is a huge, a vast, complicated subject, you know, which is because most education is determined locally. And it's controlled by everything from accreditation procedures and union rules up through, you know, national and state standard testing. What we're trying to do on a broad scale is to help develop a national, you know, set of policies and programs to support and foster arts education. But on another level is to recognize, I mean, just think about this. Everything the NEA does, everything that your arts organizations that you've come from do is ephemeral unless you bring another generation into the arts. You know, give a grant, you know, and unless you're bringing, essentially, you're continuing it. So with that realization, what we're trying to do is, especially on our national initiatives, to combine the presentation of art with arts education. I don't think that that's ever been done with the ambition or the commitment to excellence that is really necessary. For example, some of you may know this, and you probably have heard this all before, so my apologies since you heard it yesterday. One of the programs we've done is called Shakespeare in American Communities. It's the largest tour of Shakespeare in American history. Right now, we have 8 companies, soon to be 28 companies, going over to over 150 cities across all 50 states, 16 military bases, and 1,000 high schools, doing new productions of Shakespeare. And we're going into cities that are cities, for the most part, do not have live professional theaters. So there is no access to theater in those towns. Now, what we do is we come into a town, do presentations in the evening. Every one of those presentations, because we were able to raise some money from the Sallie Mae Fund, we're bringing 50 underprivileged kids and their chaperones. Now, their chaperones are there, their parents are their teachers, so that they have somebody that is an ongoing part of their life that they share this experience. So it's just not in and out, a one-time experience, but it's somehow rooted in their daily experience. Now, that's going on at night. During the days, we're visiting high schools or bringing high school students, better yet, into the theater, where they can walk into this magic place where these things happen. We've also prepared some very expensive and, I think, superb educational material: films, CDs, books, posters, handouts, even games involving Shakespeare that are going to 25,000 high schools, so that the teacher actually has material that is really, I mean, I think very engaging and attractive, that is targeted specifically for, you know, basically high school students, teenagers today, beginning where they are. And that's the kind of thing, which is to combine the presentation and arts education, and to take that and, even more importantly, decentralize it. You know, enable the schools, the theater companies, the individual presenters to take responsibility in this, but to give them the materials, the funding they need to be able to do it. So we're using that as a model for a number of other programs. But it's, you know, it's a huge, huge country. We're this year taking 10 model programs around the country, investing in them, bringing new kids into them, trying to measure the outcomes so we can create, as it were, a catalog of model programs, their materials, the pedagogy that we can make available to other communities across the country. Because the fact is that there are people right now that are doing it superbly well. They are not recognized nationally or even regionally. They're not adequately funded, and they can't expand their programs as much as they want. So we're trying to, in a sense, take the best of what already exists, add a kind of quality, a coordination measurement and everything from a national level, and see if we can't come up with, as it were, a long catalog of ideas that we can then make nationally available. But it's a huge job. Yes, sir.
My name is Yang from the Arts Institute. I have a simple question.
Yes?
Today there are more and more people in the world. Do you think there are more and more poets or fewer and fewer poets? And what's the reason why?
Well, I can't imagine that there's any time in history that there's been more poets than there are right now. And I say that just based on my daily mail. Now, the question is, are there more good ones than ever before? Well, that's a more problematic one that's inappropriate for me to discuss as the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. I do think in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen an explosion of poetry, a kind of rejuvenation of poetry, because poetry, at least in the United States, and I think in one or two Western European countries, has kind of been entered a populist phase. I think, and you see it at every level of society. And through every kind of manifestation of poetry. The creation of a new oral poetry, hip-hop, rap. The revival of a kind of ballad poetry, which is cowboy poetry. Over 200 festivals in Western America do cowboy poetry, written basically in the kind of forms of the Scottish and English ballads, almost always recited from memory. You see it in kind of yuppie, to use an old-fashioned term, sort of bourgeois, urban, in things like poetry slams, which are now really almost down to junior high levels, and you've even seen it in literary poetry in things like new formalism, which is much more oral-based, performative-based, and so you see it on the radio, or you hear it on the radio, and with people like Garrison Keillor, reciting poems on Writer's Almanac. And I think that's very good. It's a very good time to be a poet. Now, does that mean that there are more great poets? I don't necessarily think it translates into that. But at least the art form of poetry is more generally practiced now because it's escaped the university classroom than it was 20 years ago. Yes?
You mentioned this morning in your talk that the NEA represents only about 1.5% of the philanthropic arts money in the United States annually. If I have that, that correctly. So I'm sure a great part of your job consists of recommending that people look elsewhere for their funding needs.
We don't just recommend it; we require it.
Require it. Okay.
If you get money from us, you got to, except for the individual grants, it has to be matched.
So I'm curious, as broadly speaking, what do you see as some of the most underutilized funding sources, either real or potential, in America?
Well, in England, the Arts Council's chief source of funding now is through a national lottery. And that could be a potential source of funding for us. But I have to say personally, I don't think the state should solve the arts problem by doing more legalized gambling. It's a personal opinion. It has nothing to do with my agency. It's out of my control. But that would not be the mechanism by which I would want to build arts funding. I'll give you a very obvious one. If you look every year, you can look at the top 100 charity recipients of charity, of philanthropy, the top 50. You can look at the individual institutions, or you can look at the percentages of budgets of foundations. There are very few arts organizations on there. If Walter Annenberg and his wife give their collection to the Met, suddenly the Met will get up there because of the value of the art. But by and large, arts funding only appears on those lists when there has been a major capital program or a major single bequest. And so I would start by saying that a great many of the American philanthropic organizations do not give to the arts or arts education. And so I would say that the first thing I would ask is that the arts and arts education have a place at the table with a lot of philanthropies. Because I think that, a lot, that you can get a lot done for money, especially in arts education, through those kind of investments. We, for example, got $1 million this year from the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, in our Shakespeare program so that we could take Shakespeare to military bases. And the argument I made was a very simple one. There's 3 to 4 million Americans that are in the military or military families. This is the best educated, the best trained, and actually the oldest military that we have. Many more people are married and have children. They tend to live in isolated rural communities. And I worry that the programs that are provided, traditionally by the military, which tend to be popular music, movies, and kind of variety shows, do not exhaust the potential of these audience. We want to recognize the quality of individual we have in the armed forces with a greater diversity and quality of programming. And they understood that that was a valid argument. It had not been made before. So I think that part of what we need to do, and you can think of this in things like art and healthcare, art and education, art in community planning, and things like this, is to, in a sense, recognize the necessary role or the potential role that the arts play in various aspects of life, which has not been traditionally recognized. So, what I would say is there is no one answer. But what you really do need to do is by, I think, in a sense, becoming an advocate for the integration of the arts into other elements of society, from education to healthcare, and by bringing people that have, and organizations, sources of revenue that have customarily provided for those things to broaden their spectrum. At the same time, I believe that the public's role, the government's role, on a federal and state level should be enlarged. I mean, that's the argument I'm making in Washington, with some success. I hope that you know that 2 weeks ago, the President has recommended the largest increase in the NEA budget in 21 years. And so, we had the budget amended in the middle of last year, so that in 12 months, we have essentially, assuming this recommendation goes through, increased, the arts budget, by about 20%. So, so that argument, but even that is not enough. I wish that the NEA was not 1.5% of the philanthropic budget, but 1/2 of 1%. But I want it to happen by everybody giving more money, and us growing as well. If we could quadruple the amount of private philanthropy and double our budget, that would be ideal. I'd be very comfortable then to be, to be 3/4 of 1%. But there's a lot of potential. I do think that what we've seen over the last 15 years is a collapse in this country of a consensus of the necessity of federal, state, and local support of arts organizations, and a partial retrenchment of some of the private philanthropies, largely because of the stock market and economic things, and no really powerful attempts at sort of improving and broadening the funding base. Yes, the woman, you first, because you were, yes. And your name is?
Dion Donald.
Yeah.
And I'm in the AIE program. I guess presumably the U.S. Poet Laureate, represents something or reflects something about the spirit of the nation at the time they're appointed. And I was wondering, what do you feel about Louise Blick as the U.S. Poet Laureate? And why do you think? What about the spirit of our nation now do you think she reflects?
Well, the Poet Laureate of the United States is an office of the Library of Congress. Archibald MacLeish, when he became Librarian of Congress, poet, also Harvard professor, was a Boylston Professor of Rhetoric at Harvard at the end of his public career, wanted to, in a sense, make poetry and art that the Library of Congress took seriously. And so he created, I think, a very dignified office for a republic, which was called the Poetry Consultant at the Library of Congress. And this had an extraordinarily distinguished history from the 40s up through the mid-80s. In the mid-80s, it was decided that this office would be upgraded because there was Senator Sparks Matsunaga of Hawaii who was a great fan of poetry, and he'd been trying to do this, and he was about to retire, so the Senate decided that they would, for his last term, that they would do this, and they created a wonderful. I think the title is something like the U.S. Poet Laureate Poetry Consultant at the Library of Congress. I think is the official title. It's like the Office of Redundancy Department, and that's had, I think, a very distinguished history too. So now James Billington, who's the Librarian of Congress, actually asked for my consultation among many other people in terms of this thing. And I asked him, I said, well, what are you looking for? And I said, because, I gave him a list of a whole bunch of potential candidates. I said, if you want this kind of a poet, if you want somebody who can do this. And I was thinking in terms of like the kind of constituencies, the kind of things. And he was, I think he gave a wonderful answer. He says, I want somebody, a poet of distinction whose work is excellent and whose work will be read in the future. And I think Louise Glick is a wonderful choice in that regard. I mean, she's a poet of great excellence, not what one would think of necessarily as a public poet. It's a very intensely personal, kind of intensely lyric sort of poetry. But I think it's a rather wonderful thing in a curious way. Now, that is a kind of possibility of poetry that is recognized, in a sense, in a public office. So, will she be different than Billy Collins? Absolutely. But that, to me, is the beauty of the office. It's about a 2-year appointment. And so you can sort of go through different sorts of people. And if you look at the poetry consultants at the Library of Congress, everybody's supposed to have had a project, and they did very different projects from each other. But cumulatively, over half a century, they've done a wonderful variety of projects, as befits a nation of this, complexity and diversity. But anyway, but I think it's excellence and dedication to literature is really what Louise Glick, brings to the office at the moment. Yes.
My name is Danielle Scotton. I'm curious about the Shakespeare in American Communities program,
Mm-hmm.
and the process by which now it's going to be 28
Mm-hmm.
theater companies are chosen to represent Shakespeare in American
Yeah.
communities, as well as the education programs that have been developed. Who
Mm-hmm.
made those decisions, and how was that process?
Yeah, well,
and who created those educational?
Yeah, the program has been in 3 stages, and so so the first stage is we wanted to create a tour. Now the tour was created for several reasons. First was theatrical touring has almost vanished in this country because of expense, and in fact there are lots of presenters, people that manage community theaters, university theaters, and things like this, that no longer book drama, or in some cases, for newer facilities, have never booked drama. So one of the first things we wanted to do was to see if we could revive the tradition of theatrical touring. Not just Shakespeare, but theatrical touring. And Shakespeare, by creating like a national umbrella, which would kind of additional publicity to local presentations. So we put out a national invitation for people to apply under 3 criteria. The first was artistic excellence. Second was the ability to tour. Because it's one thing saying, "Oh, I'm going to go to 17 states in 34 days, or I'm going to be on the road for 17 weeks," and actually being able to do it. And third was experience in educational outreach programs. We got about, I think 26 thereabout final applications. I mean, a lot of people sort of called and said, "Oh, they realized what it really was and they couldn't do it." Of which we picked 6: the Guthrie of Minnesota, the Acting Company of New York, the Aquila Theater of New York, the Arkansas Repertory Theater, Chicago Shakespeare Theater, and the Artist Repertory Theater of Portland, Oregon, which is doing a joint production with the Central Dramatic Company of Vietnam, which is a bilingual production with bilingual super titles, which premiered the play in Hanoi, Midsummer Night's Dream. Although the tragedies are popular in Vietnam, this is a comedy that had never been performed in Vietnamese before, and now they're bringing it on tour. When we were able to get the Shakespeare money from the military, we brought on the Alabama Shakespeare Festival, which is able, to tour specifically those areas. They had been a finalist in the, in terms of the first round, And then we got some additional money by able to bring out the Will Geer Theatrum Botanicum in Los Angeles, one of the really great repertory theaters in the West. Now, specifically those two, we were looking for specific ability to tour specific areas. The second wave of them is we have the applications out right now, and I think the deadline is still open. February 15th, yeah, a couple more days. Here, what we're really looking for companies of artistic excellence, educational outreach, that may not be able to tour nationally, but could tour, their own state, their own metropolitan area, which allows a kind of company to get some experience. Because just to truck sets, to house actors, especially, and these are all union equity, actors. So there's all kinds of equity rules that apply, and there's even to contract them from, things like this. It's very complicated. And so, what we're trying to do there, and we've written some very specific requests in some of them. I want to be able to have some presentations on Indian nations, and which we're unable to reach at the moment. And so, so that's what's going on right now. Now, the educational material we developed because there's a great deal of variety among this material that these companies do. Some of them do superb jobs, some of them do not so good. But none of them can really afford to produce films, CDs, and things like that. So we got their educational material together, got some of the people that worked on it, and then we were able actually to go to places like Hollywood and ask for film clips and things like this. And so we put together just a dynamite film, but nobody could really do it except the NEA because Miramax and MGM and Universal are not going to give their clips to free, to an educational company or whatever. But representing this, and the same thing as we got people like James Earl Jones, Michael York, Harold Bloom, Mel Gibson to basically donate their time to record speeches and things like that. But that's how it was done, and so we're trying to do it in a way where if you can do it once at a national level, it's affordable. But no single company, even consortium of companies, could afford to do it. But it's been a challenge, but we need to learn to develop these things in partnership. We have about 162 partners right now for Shakespeare. It's going to be over 200 by the end of the program. Presenters, regional things, state things. So are we running out of time? I see you.
We have a little ritual we have to do now.
Okay, well, this guy fellow here has one more question, and that will be the last.
I'm Dave Marshall from the Massachusetts Cultural Council.
Yes. Yes, we've met before, haven't we?
I was there yesterday.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious about one of the major issues that we face here in the state, besides the art dramatic cutbacks in our state funding and local cutbacks in arts education specialists and so forth, is the whole fallout from No Child Left Behind.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that the arts are, of course, subject in there, but I'm wondering if you are carrying on any kind of dialogue with the Department of Education or other members of the Bush administration to communicate the damaging effects.
Yeah, no, that's exactly. I mean, actually, we were talking about the question that I think you asked about this. Is what we're trying to do right now is to put together, is to coordinate what we do with the Department of Education and the Office of Domestic Affairs in the White House to be able to put together an administration's program on this. It's very complicated just because of the complexity. I mean, I've never seen a field as complicated as public education. I mean, so what we're trying to do most of all is something that works. So we're making basically we're putting together trial programs that range from creating a principals institute to train, taking in schools the top 5 to 10 people, in a school about how to incorporate the arts, as well as, separately, we're developing individual programs that we're testing. We're trying to measure the learning, the outcomes, what kind of positive aura that it creates, not just academically but socially for kids, so that we can put together a cogent and compelling case for this. I honestly believe that if we can do this effectively, that we'll be able to fund it. I mean, I don't think that's the problem. I think right now, it's a field that no one knows what to do, and You know, and it's just, and somebody needs to pull all these various parties together. So, but it's a challenge. It's the biggest challenge that I face. But it's also, I think we also understand it's the most important thing that we're trying to do. But the Department of Education and the NEA are working together. You know, we actually have people detailed, and so that's now underway.
I'm so subtle, aren't I?
Yep.
David, you should come, and on April 6th, Dick Deasy's coming from Art Education Partnership to
Yeah.
talk about
Yeah, Dick would be a good person to talk, because Dick is involved in this.
He's going to talk about the implications for Art Ed of the No Child Left Behind. One of the things he didn't mention, it's absolutely true of everybody in this room, is that like you, in our different little hemispheres, from classrooms to schools to community art centers and museums and Harvard University, we're all advocating for the importance of the arts in our various cultures. And I'd just like to thank you. I mean, if you can't sell it, none of us can. Thank you for such a wonderful, wonderful talk. We have a ritual, which I tried to prepare you for by sharing with you the ways that our students are asked to create something, to turn their thoughts into things in response to readings and various issues in the field. And the ritual is that for each of the guest speakers who are kind enough to come and share their expertise with us, a student selects that speaker to prepare a gift tribute, a thought into thing, and I would like to present to you the student who has asked to do one for you, Heather Cotter.
Thank you. Okay. Shall I stand, sit, or run?
Whatever you prefer, wherever you're most.
Yeah, I'll sit down.
Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Heather Cotter. I'm a student in the Arts and Education program here at Harvard. And today it's my great honor, on behalf of our class, to present Chairman Gioia with this tribute, this gift tribute. Really in gratitude for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and speak with us here today. In recognition of your impressive achievements at the National Endowment of the Arts and your individual interest in poetry, I composed a poem as this gift tribute today, inspired by the admirable work being done by all of us to build a national consciousness of the fundamental importance of the arts. I have a sense that there are some accomplished poets in the audience today, so I'll ask you to indulge my amateur attempts as I read my poem to you. Tree of Wisdom. An old oak blooms in a meadow, thick with age, heavy with knowledge of radiant sunrises and sounds of awakenings. A steadfast profile, gnarled by stormy days weathered over long years. Layers of acquired armor ringing the hardwood, protecting inner strength. The tree has stood on this site as long as time can remember. Roots pierce the earth deeply, gripping the ground, unshakable. Branches extend out in all directions like arms seeking satisfaction in an embrace. Foliage fingers of leaves interlaced in a canopy, shading, shielding, a shelter for those seeking refuge. Discontent and solitude, the tree sprinkles its seeds. Smothered by weighty soil and stone, gasping, fighting, stretching, trying, breaking free of impeding barriers, bending towards the light, reaching for the future, ensuring one day the old oak will dwell in a forest.
Thank you very much. Oaks are my favorite tree.